What in the world are you doing?
Don't you know? This is the time of year when we all ride to the Great Pumpkin and tell him what we want for Halloween. The Great Pumpkin loves little children. I can see him now, rising up out of the pumpkin patch with his big bag of toys.
This comic strip from 26 October 1959 is the first time that the Great Pumpkin, an unseen Santa Claus-like character, is mentioned in Daily Peanuts comic strips. From this humble origin sprang a cultural touchstone so widely known that I'd say you'd be hard-pressed to find many people, in the United States at least, who wouldn't immediately know who the Great Pumpkin is and, what is more, what he represents. For almost every year thereafter, until Peanuts finished its run in 2000, the Great Pumpkin's storyline would feature every year at Halloween. And what started as a simple gag where Linus confuses Halloween with Christmas slowly became something far more profound, as we shall see. It's the Great Pumpkin Charlie Brown was the third Peanuts television special, premiering on 27 October 1966, and it has run every year since, even into this internet age where you can almost always find it easily online. I think this is because it has become an integral part of the American Halloween experience, embodying part of what we think Halloween should be and, to a degree, who we think we are, or at least were, as a people. For those who don't know, It's the Great Pumpkin Charlie Brown deals primarily with Linus, Lucy Van Pelt's little brother and Charlie Brown's best friend, and his annual vigil in the most sincere pumpkin patch he can find, where he believes
On Halloween night, the Great Pumpkin rises out of his pumpkin patch and flies through the air with his bag of toys for all the children.
You can tell that Linus has done this Great Pumpkin bit before, as Lucy, Charlie Brown, and the others react with exasperation at Linus, yet again, foregoing the joys of Halloween to sit all night in a pumpkin patch waiting for a mythological figure that only Linus believes in. In the background, a lot of other Halloween-y things are happening. The kids are prepping their costumes for tricks or treats. Violet is throwing a big Halloween party afterwards that all the kids, even Charlie Brown, are invited to. And Snoopy is preparing for an air battle with the Red Baron that'll lead to his plane being shot down behind enemy lines. And behind all this is a gorgeous, simple palette of fall colors and Bill Melendez's deep purple, blue, black skyscapes. It's beautiful. As Rich Cohen wrote in his New York Times article, The Magic of Linus and the Great Pumpkin, here was a planet made for kids, a planet without school and without parents, where the leaves of autumn turn into a sort of phantasmagoria experienced when you get too close to the paste. It's the Great Pumpkin Charlie Brown is about Halloween, but features a whole range of cultural touchstones, including war nostalgia, generosity, community, faith. That last one, faith, may come as a surprise and be more generally associated with a Charlie Brown Christmas. I'm going to argue, though, that the Halloween special deals more with faith, whereas the Christmas special deals more with hope. That said, on to our central character, Linus Van Pelt. Linus first shows up in 1952 and is the strip's resident philosopher and theologian. He's highly intelligent. Indeed, though he's the younger brother of Lucy, Charlie Brown's contemporary, Linus eventually appears in school with Charlie Brown, leading me to imagine that he was bumped up a year because of his intellect. Charlie Brown and Linus are best friends and confidants, often shown musing together over the brick wall. Like a lot of gifted kids, Linus doesn't seem to know how to balance his intelligence with his age. And his insecurities are brought forth mostly by this classic fixation he has with sucking his thumb and holding his blanket. It's strange, but the character's so compelling and learned that he almost makes the blanket thumb thing seem meditative, like he's a kind of postmodern Buddha. And of course, Linus, who frequently quotes the Bible, has a theological bent that is expressed in his annual cycle of keeping vigil, awaiting the Great Pumpkin. As we saw earlier, this started in 1959 as a gag where Linus seems to be confusing the themes of Halloween with Christmas. In that first year, many of the elements of the Great Pumpkin gag were missing, like Linus's Pumpkin Patch Vigil. That doesn't happen until the following year, 1960, and the person who keeps him company that night isn't Sally, who at that point in the strip was still a baby, but Linus's best friend, Charlie Brown. Sally sits with him in 1962, and that's where most of the gags used in the TV special Vigil were lifted. In subsequent years, Linus would be accompanied by Peppermint Patty, Snoopy, Marcy, and Rerun, his little brother. The Great Pumpkin has been repeatedly put forth as a metaphor for faith, either for or against or undecided. All you have to do is do a Google search of Great Pumpkin faith, and you'll get a deluge, pun intended, of links using the titular squash to argue for a wide variety of positions. They run the gamut from the Great Pumpkin being a symbol for faith in Christ, to it being a metaphor for belief in false gods, to it being a metaphor for the folly of faith, to Linus's faith being an act of neo-pagan artistic creativity. And this last one from Michael Atkinson, from his article, "Oh Great Pumpkin, Where Are You?" is, I'm not kidding, awesome. The show isn't a parable of faith versus greed so much as a paradigm of unorthodoxy. Thus, there's a tragic inevitability at the heart of the story. Linus does not surrender, even as the credits roll, and we all know what happens to uncompromising individualists in a conformist world, especially those whose dreams or art will not be relinquished however much they openly contradict the status quo. We should want Linus to give up and forget about his personal godling for his own sake, but at the same time we hope he doesn't. We hope he heroically grips his lunatic mythos with both hands and never says die. The cost of such a commitment can be, we know, extreme and even mortal, but when a child's crazy, skylarking convictions get erased, we all lose a bit of our human fire. Similarly, an article by Neil Carter in his Godless in Dixie blog on Pathos.com made the case for why the Great Pumpkin special is about the folly of faith. What makes this little melodrama so instructive is the way that Linus has built up around his belief system a protective fortress made up entirely of excuses for why the Great Pumpkin never shows. Ultimately, his thought processes tell us a lot about how we ourselves process our religious beliefs. First of all, Linus has completely internalized the responsibility for excusing the Great Pumpkin's failure to appear. Second, conditions for the Great Pumpkin's appearance are so exacting that he need never appear at all to confirm Linus's belief. Finally, Linus's unshakable faith caused him to see exactly what he wanted to see. Now, Schultz initially denied that the Great Pumpkin was anything more than a kid confusing Halloween with Christmas, and I imagine this was true in the beginning. But over the years, at least in the comics, the narrative undeniably shifted towards faith, though of a kind that was ephemeral and less easily categorized. Said John Updike in his article, Sparky from St. Paul. Schultz's own religiosity seems to have quietly faded, though he continued to contribute a cartoon panel to the Church of God magazine and, for a time, taught Methodist Sunday School in Sebastopol. His manifold newspaper interviews trace a gradual withdrawal. "I'm not an Orthodox believer, and I'm becoming less of one all the time," said Schultz. Robert Short, the author of the immensely successful The Gospel According to Peanuts, admitted Sparky could sound like the conservatives, but there was always this very humanistic, liberal strain that was beneath the surface. In Schultz's strip, the Great Pumpkin episodes verge on travesty, if not blasphemy. For the record, I see nothing incompatible between humanism and Christianity, and I think both travesty and blasphemy here is a bit harsh. I wouldn't go beyond parody, and even then of a kind that makes you think. But you see here what is contended by faith in the Peanuts strip and also in the Great Pumpkin special. Both are imbued with philosophy and religiosity, but of a non-specific, applicable kind. I think what's up with the pumpkin storyline is best expressed by a strip I discovered while listening to an interview by Pastor Dwight Lenhoff with Stephen J. Lind about Lind's book, A Charlie Brown Religion. Snoopy is writing a book on theology, and when Charlie Brown suggests that he better have a good title, we see that it's, "Has it ever occurred to you that you might be wrong?" Schultz's target was certitude, and the Great Pumpkin gags reflect this aversion to religious certainty. Over the years, as the religious jokes became more frequent, you can see that the butt of the jokes is fundamentalism and theological rigidity. In 1962, Lucy converts to Great Pumpkinism, only to have Linus declare her patch hypocritical with no explanation. In 1964, Linus loses an election for class president when he feels compelled to evangelize for the Great Pumpkin in front of the school, a gag that's repeated in the 1972 special, You're Not Elected, Charlie Brown. In 1965, Linus and Charlie Brown have a religious argument over the Great Pumpkin, which is reconciled only when Charlie Brown explains that no point of doctrine is worth splitting up a friendship. And then there's the running gag of Linus going door to door like a Jehovah's Witness or a Mormon to hand out pamphlets and spread the good news of the Great Pumpkin. All the humor is derived not from Linus's faith, but from his certainty and evangelism.
We are obviously separated by denominational differences.
But I find nothing in Peanuts is sacrilegious or even a-religious. Quite the contrary. From Michael Koreski's article, It's the Great Pumpkin, Charlie Brown. The entire Peanuts tableau, from Schultz's very first comic strip in 1950, suggests there is something outside of the characters, watching with an omniscience that cannot easily be described as authoritative or judgmental. There is a compassionate presence here, an unseen force that guides these children, each weighted down by oversized, over-contemplative candy apple heads as they treat each other with alternating calumny and sympathy. And this is especially true of the Great Pumpkin TV special, which is often perceived as a more fun and secular romp than A Charlie Brown Christmas. And while I'd agree that Great Pumpkin is less religious, it is all about faith. Rich Cohen again. Next to its predecessor, A Charlie Brown Christmas, which culminates in the transcendent moment when Linus recites the Annunciation to the shepherds from the Gospel of Luke, the Great Pumpkin might seem less profound, yet the show is the purest parable of faith I know. Faith, yes, but not the commodified certainty that one prayer equals one blink. For just as A Charlie Brown Christmas is about the commercialization of Christmas, it's the Great Pumpkin incorporates the commodification of Halloween.
And it could have had candy, apples, and gum, and cooking money and all sorts of things.
And Linus's struggle for something sincere and unhypocritical, dare I say sacred. You could argue that, for Linus, the Great Pumpkin with his bag of toys is no better. And yet, I don't think Linus's concern here is for stuff. The promise of toys seems more something he's using to appeal to other people. What I hear from Linus over and over is that he's looking for something better. As Michael Koreski says, in a sense, even before the start of It's the Great Pumpkin, Linus has already been waiting for a sign, something that will literally drop from the sky and make itself known as a messenger of good tidings. And that's really at the heart of what faith is. As much as it's belief in something you cannot prove, it's more recognizing that something is missing and putting yourself out there to figure out what that is. This is often an exercise in the silly or unorthodox, at least as other people see it. And I think real faith is often alienating and frustrating. For all its emotional sturm, faith never quite delivers on its promised moment of spiritual ecstasy. We come close at times, a few precious times, to stumbling over some infinite truth out in the frozen wastelands of space, only to be whipped back into the temporal by the failure of our own Great Pumpkin to deliver.
Oh, Great Pumpkin, where are you?
And many people never get beyond that. It occurs to far too few that if the great pumpkin would actually show, it would be the end of a wonderful and far more fulfilling hope that he will arrive. Plus, maybe Linus's faith is a long-game concept, and today's belief in the silly shows up years later as something far more profound, mysterious, and inexplicable. What does that mean? Let me give you two scenarios. Take Lucy. In Great Pumpkin, her reputation as a crabapple and as an antagonist belies how much she genuinely cares about Linus. Yes, she mocks and belittles his absurd beliefs, but I think this is tough love, shock therapy to keep Linus, and herself, from being ridiculed. And in scenes that were deleted for commercials when I was a kid, an embarrassed Lucy bothers to ask for extra candy for her brother.
Can I have an extra piece of candy for my stupid brother? He couldn't come with us because he's sitting in a pumpkin patch, waiting for the great pumpkin.
And goes outside for him at 4 a.m., brings him to bed, and takes off his shoes and socks in what Rich Cohen called one of the most tender moments ever captured on TV. Who's to say how this moment and this memory will affect Linus's relationship to his sister? Might she grudgingly admire Linus's conviction and toughness in the face of ridicule? Might that become the basis for an unbreakable bond as siblings? One day, when Lucy has a crisis of faith not dissimilar to Linus's, will Linus be the one to find her in the dark, shivering, and help her home? And I ask, is that not sincere? Is that not sacred? Scenario 2. Linus is alone in the pumpkin patch with his faith in the great pumpkin and has years of abject disappointment. Linus invites Sally to sit with him, as we see in the Halloween special.
Wouldn't you like to sit with me in the pumpkin patch on Halloween night and wait for the great pumpkin?
And it's quite wonderful until the great pumpkin doesn't show. Sally goes nuts, and Linus is left alone again in his faith in the pumpkin. And it seems that's the end of it. But as Linus and Sally grow older, the memory of that night together ceases to be about disappointment and becomes a beloved, innocent memory about a beautiful, crisp autumn evening that ended in absurdity, a story that can be retold and laughed at and wondered about. That bond, that core shared memory, can become a date, a marriage, children, all of whom receive this foundational story about sitting in a pumpkin patch on Halloween. Will Linus and Sally's grandchildren sit in pumpkin patches, waiting for the great pumpkin, thinking about how their grandparents had done the same thing long ago? Linus's faith in something unseen, which leads him to do the absurd, manifests as faith in something concrete, yet still connected to the mystery that defined that night in the pumpkin patch. And I ask again, is that not sacred? Is that not sincere?
I don't see how a pumpkin patch could be more sincere than this one. You can look all around and it's not a sign of hypocrisy. Nothing but sincerity as far as the eye can see.
Linus in this scene isn't simply describing what he sees, but is actively creating it as he speaks. Because what you see is often not even close to what's there. And that is the realm of faith. I'll end with another bit from Michael Atkinson. Martyred or not in our imaginations, Linus's courageous resistance in the pumpkin patch voices a universal plaintiveness. All children instinctively muster questions and fears about existence and God. "Oh, great pumpkin, where are you?" the child wails alone into the night in a scalding moment of doubt, followed by a fade to ominous black and a commercial break. Effectively asking the most fundamental of human questions, Linus's triumph is not so much his indomitable faith, but his headlong act of creation, which is, in the end, the only thing that can save us.